Apologies, we're having issues with the presentation in person. Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Okay, thank you for your patience. We acknowledge this conference is presented on land that has been stewarded by Indigenous people since before European colonization. As we work to heal the destruction caused by colonization, we appreciate your support, solidarity, and continued learning. This link, nativeland.ca, is a helpful resource to figure out whose land you are occupying at any point in time. Oh my gosh. Here are a few racial justice organizations in the region that we encourage you to support through sharing land, funding, and connections. Other ways to center racial equity in your own community is to protect the rights of farm and food workers, support legislation to advance the work of reparations, and again, supporting BIPOC-led organizations. Feel free to put in the chat or share out here if there are any others in your area. Along those lines, with One Vivir as our theme, we aim to bring to light the ancestral wisdoms of Indigenous peoples of the Global South, including the Aymara, Quechua, and Mapuche people, in an agricultural system built on stolen land and the forced labor and exploitation of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. Our conference aims to center equity in our food system. So if you're here during lunch, in this room there will be a BIPOC caucus, and in the dining hall room there will be a White Ally caucus that we would be excited for you to join. Thank you to Stonyfield and our other partner level sponsors, as well as other sponsors of the conference. Also, nofamass is growing. Here are a few current openings that we welcome you to find more details at online. So with that, I'd like to welcome Heidi Dollard, who is a very active member of the Massachusetts Pollinator Network Steering Committee. She works to educate gardeners and homeowners on how they can support pollinators and other beneficial wildlife while creating a beautiful and low maintenance landscape. She has an MS in biology and is a master gardener and has been an enthusiastic native plant gardener for many years. So thank you, Heidi.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you all for coming. I think that the problem of invasives is one of the worst that we face when we're trying to maintain our environment or restore our environment. I think it's something that's not getting enough attention. We're in a situation where we're losing species of all types at a very rapid rate, actually an increasing rate. Is very alarming. This chart just shows since 2007, and of particular concern to, I think, the people in this conference is that we're losing our native pollinators. So this headline says that in the past 2 decades, we've lost 90% of our Native American bumblebees, which are probably our most effective and efficient pollinators. So one of the problems is that our landscape everywhere we look, everywhere I look, is now becoming completely covered with invasive plants. I just a show of hands for the people here. How many people know what bittersweet looks like? And how many people feel they can see it recognize it from a moving car? Yeah, well, I wish more people were like you, and I wish to install in you a sense of urgency, not to mention panic on this question. So I want to talk first about some definitions to get clear. An invasive plant is a plant that is not from our area, did not evolve in our area. It's probably something from Asia or Europe that came over to this area either through horticultural trade, maybe by accident, maybe it could have come in like, in the seeds in the stomach of an animal. It could have been planted intentionally. A lot of our invasive plants were planted intentionally, but it's not something, to make it very kind of simple-minded, it was not something here before Columbus came to North America. So it's also a plant. Of course, our environment is filled with non-native plants, many of which we cherish, but these are plants that are really causing harm, that they're harm to the environment, or they're harm to human health, or they're harm to our economy. So in practice, they spread rapidly, they displace or actively harm native plants. And here's the big problem. They do not feed the native fauna. They are not part of the food web. And, you know, yes, birds will eat seeds of bittersweet, but it's not providing all the nutrition they need. There's some evidence that it's not even providing good nutrition. And of course, as birds eat those seeds, they fly away, they poop them all over the place, and they spread them. And that's one reason why we see invasives taking over our landscape at actually an accelerating rate. So if you think, well, it's a good thing that birds are eating seeds of invasive plants, it's not a good thing. They are not really part of the local food web. In particular, insects don't eat them. And insects are the critical base layer that enables animals at higher trophic levels to get nutrition from plants. So they link plants to animals. They outcompete native plants for sun and water and nutrients. So a lot of times I hear people talking about native plants being invasive. No, a native plant by these definitions cannot be invasive. It can be very aggressive. You can hate Canada goldenrod, but it is not invasive. It is just very aggressive. And yes, it can take over your field and can be really annoying, but it is in fact a very important part of our native food web. So that's an important distinction, I think, we need to know. So why are why are we seeing them everywhere now? This list is not true of every invasive plant, but it's true of many of them. They have an extended growth period. So they leaf out very early. They hold their leaves well into late winter. They're photosynthesizing for a longer period. A lot of them have just produce enormous amounts of seeds. They grow really rapidly. A lot of them have a suckering habit. They grow by underground rhizomes very quickly. A lot of them can regrow from just a little piece of seed, or root, or sometimes even a little piece of stem. They tolerate a wide range of growing conditions, especially in disturbed sites. And of course, the human landscape is becoming basically one big disturbed site. Road margins, new development, new building. Our farms are replowed every year. All of those are really disturbed sites. They don't have any natural controls. They don't have diseases, predators that would keep them in check in the places that they came from. Some of them produce allelopathic compounds. They put out chemicals into the surrounding soil that actually either kills nearby plants or prevents other plants from germinating. So garlic mustard is an example of an invasive plant that does this. And many of them, not most of them, are not eaten by deer and other herbivores. So why are they a problem? Okay, they are at a very rapid rate. They are displacing our native plants, which effectively reduces the food supply of our native animals, insects, birds, and herbivores. Most of them are not eaten by deer, thereby placing much more browsing and grazing pressure on what remaining native populations remain. They change that they're not adapted. They don't have symbiotic and other relationships with the soil organisms and fungus, which, as we know, is really important for maintaining a healthy ecosystem. And the net result is that they're hastening the extinction of native species. So farms, as I said, are especially vulnerable to invasion. There's so much edge habitat, and invasives are particularly good at planting themselves on forest margins. And this is actually a picture of a CSA farm that I belong to. I actually have reason to visit a lot of farms, and everywhere I go, they have nice, hedgerows and wooded strips, which are really important for pollinators, but they're becoming completely taken over by bittersweet, multiflora rose, and some other really, really pernicious invasive plants. So if you walked up close to this row of trees, you would see at the ground level, it's bittersweet, it's honeysuckles, all kinds of woody plants that have gotten a toehold, and the bittersweet is climbing into the trees. Now, of course, if you're a farmer or a gardener, any kind of landowner, you're not sitting on your hands. You're really busy. And a lot of what you're doing is really time critical. You have to plant the seed when it's time to plant. You have to harvest. You have to weed. It's really hard to fit in cleaning invasive plants out of hedgerows. It just doesn't seem to pop up. But by ignoring this problem, it's getting worse and worse, and you're decreasing the availability of native pollinators to your crops. So there are many, many. I could be talking for about a week on all of the invasive plants. Massachusetts has 69 plants. Some of them are much, much more difficult to deal with and much more prevalent than others. So I chose 8 to talk about today in more detail. My top 2 worst ones are knotweed and bittersweet, which I see everywhere. Those 2 things have become, I'm really wondering how long it's going to be before they become the majority of the biomass in our Massachusetts landscape. Just from the time that I started, I've been able to identify native plants from a moving car for about 5 years. And I hike a lot, I walk a lot. And I would say in that 5 years, I've seen a huge increase in the biomass of in particular, these 2 native plants. So I will go into detail about them, but I also want to talk about how you can identify these plants if you don't already. There's some really good websites, and at the end, I'll have a QR code that has links to everything, that all the organizations and resources that I've mentioned in this talk. So if you just take a picture of that QR code, it will lead to a document which has all this information. So the Connecticut Invasive Plant Working Group is probably the best resource for us because they're right next door. They share pretty much all of our native plants. They have a lot of really, really good information, a lot of really good pictures. Another really good resource is the Maine Natural Areas Program, and they have published this guide, which I think is one of the best. You don't have to buy a hard copy. You can download a PDF and print it out, or just print out the pages that are relevant. That downloading the PDF is free. But I think it's really helpful to have something that you can walk around your property and actually look at. So one of the things that I really encourage you to do is to do some sort of an assessment of what you've got and to understand what's out there. Now, as I say, bittersweet, I think, is hard to miss, especially these days, as is knotweed. But there's a lot of other things out there that you would do well to notice when there's just a little bit of it, so you can get on top of it before there's a lot of it. So Massachusetts actually has 2 invasive plant lists. One, I think, is more the prohibited plant list. Those are plants that are not supposed to be sold commercially. And I have to say, I think Massachusetts is doing a terrible job on this topic. When they declare that something should not be sold commercially, they have like a 5-year period where they allow the nurseries to clear their stock, which is just inexcusable, in my opinion. You know, if they really, really wanted to, they could say, we'll buy what you have, and then, you know, they could make sure that it was never planted anywhere. So, you know, they're really just, well, they're not really taking this problem seriously. And I think that they're really caving to a lot of big business interests. So I think it's good to know what's on the Massachusetts lists, but there probably should be a lot more, and they don't really have a lot of good resources either. But Maine and Connecticut do. I also use smartphone apps a lot if I'm in any doubt about what I'm looking at. And I like to use iNaturalist, and I think it's quite reliable for native plants. iNaturalist is free. Some of the other ones you have to pay for, or you have to go through a little workaround each time to avoid paying for it. But I think iNaturalist, Seek would probably work really well too for native plants, because I mean invasive plants, because they probably have a lot of information about them in their databases. So, you know, either approach. So this is the link to this field guide I was talking about. This will also be in the resources document at the end. So if you're trying to kind of assess your property, a good thing to do is to go out early in the spring, because as I said, a lot of the invasives leaf out early. It's really easy in particular to spot multiflora rose. It's bright green when everything else is still dead and gray and brown. So you can kind of see where it is and where you might want to attack it. Then later there's flowers that can actually be very easy to see. And then later on there's berries. It's really good to look at these things all through the season so that you can identify them at all life stages and all, you know, if you just need the flower or the berry, then you're very limited in your ability to find them and eradicate them throughout the year. I should also mention that bittersweet in particular looks really different as a little tiny seedling, and then as it grows, the leaves change shape. So it's really a good idea to be able to identify those little guys out there and just grab them before they've had a chance to really put out roots, which they do really, really quickly. So here are the management methods that are most often recommended. I would like to say just use organic methods. I would really like to be strictly organic, but I'm afraid that the problem has become so enormous that it's out of control. If you have a small area and you are persistent, you really can just eradicate anything, any of these invasives, just with repeated cutting or mowing or weed whacking. This is called carbon deprivation. And no plant, no matter how tough and invasive, can survive if they're cut off at the soil line several times a year. May take a really long time, may take a lot of effort, but it can be done. So if you really, really want to avoid any kind of herbicide, there are ways. Some things can also be eradicated with smothering, but you have to really understand the biology of the plant that you're dealing with. For example, knotweed can grow through concrete. So there's really no point in trying to smother knotweed. So if you do your homework and understand the best approach, you have the best chance of success, and also you won't be wasting all your time and energy. So some things will work with smothering. Pulling, grubbing, digging, it's kind of a variation on carbon deprivation. But with all of these things, some plants that really have a lot of resources in their roots, this will stimulate them to quickly regrow. And a lot of people have seen that when they cut bittersweet, or it just seems to just like spring up as if it just got, a big shot of fertilizer or something. Yeah, it will do that. But if you keep cutting it, if you have the wherewithal to do that. So I know some organic land managers get a weed whacker, and they just walk around with a weed whacker like time and time and time again, and that will work. The downside of the weed whacker approach, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, is that you cannot selectively weed whack just one kind of plant. You're going to be weed whacking everything. And that might be fine, especially if you have a very thick stand of invasive plants. But one of the reasons why we want to get rid of the invasives is that we want to encourage and preserve the native plants. And in particular, our trees are really in trouble, because a lot of trees are having trouble germinating, and their seedlings are not able to grow through this invasive understory layer. So if you just whack everything, you're going to be whacking tree seedlings and other valuable native plants. So, you have to kind of evaluate the situation and use your judgment. So here's actually what I do, because I think this is the most efficient and least harmful approach. I cut and paint with an herbicide. The active ingredient is tricloper. I use the brand names Brush Tox. I did this actually on the advice of Doug Tallamy, because he has really talked about the importance of eliminating native plants. He has a very large property. Supposedly his wife, who's a middle-aged woman like me, cleared acres and acres, and this is how she did it. So what I do is I cut, this works for woody plants. You cut it at the soil line, you dab the cut end. I have this ridiculous, very expensive little bottle called a buckthorn blaster, which I'm not necessarily endorsing, but you put the herbicide in it, you dab, you have to cut and dab right away. You can paint if there's any stems sticking out, you can paint a little more. And, I've probably, in maybe 5 years of doing this on my property, I probably haven't used more than maybe 2 cups of herbicide on like acres of property. So I think this is the least damaging to the environment. But if you are committed to organic methods, I applaud and encourage you. For some things, repeated tilling will work. I'm also not really endorsing repeated tilling. This is a case where you have to really understand what you're dealing with, because if you just churn up some of the roots, you could just be creating a huge mess. You could be making it way worse. So understand what you've got. It's probably in a fallow field. You could do it, for example, with some some very small multiflora rows, but then you'd have to go through and follow up and try to dig out as much of the roots as possible. Goats and sheep. Goats will eat some invasive plants. I'm not a goat keeper, so I don't have firsthand knowledge, but my sources, both personal and doing research on the internet, indicate that they will eat multiflora rose. They will eat buckthorn. I believe they will also eat bittersweet. They will not, they will just eat the leaves. They might eat some of the stems, but so this is kind of the equivalent of just cutting, you know, this is basically a version of carbon deprivation. And when the goats go, the plants will spring back. But what you could do is use this as a first approach and then come through and do something else depending on what the plant is. You could, you know, do the cut and paint. You could grub out the rest. I don't really know much about pigs, but I understand that pigs will actually grub things out of the soil. I also am told that they will eat the leaves, but not the stems of knotweed, which actually might be a good thing, because I was talking to a woman who works for the Westfield Wild and Scenic, and she heads up a team that goes into the headwaters of streams and they remove knotweed. They do it completely organically, completely by hand. But what they see is that, you know, they cut and then everything resprouts. But they think that if they leave a few leaves on each stem, that suppresses the plant's whatever mechanisms cause it to resprout again. So that's something you could try, but the goats also might just eat enough of the leaves to weaken the plant without stimulating that rapid regrowth. So if you have goats, give this a try, let me know. The other thing about goats is that you would have to pen them into a very small area, that you would have to make sure that that was all they had to eat for at least a few hours. So they really chomp down on those invasives. So there's a technique involved. All the government agencies are going to mention foliar herbicides, at least for some. I really think that that is just too dangerous. Foliar herbicides spread over the landscape are going to kill all kinds of, there's just going to be, you know, they're going to kill the insects. It could be killing small animals. You know, frogs and toads are very sensitive to this kind of thing. This is why it just terrifies me to see how much land has been taken over by invasives, because if this is ever to be reclaimed, these acres and acres of land, people are going to go in and do foliar spraying. So this is another reason that I want to encourage or inspire or implore you to at least manage your own land or part of your own land and keep the invasives at least under control, so that the next person or the next whoever inherits your land when you're gone is not, in order to restore it, does not come in with these chemicals. You know, I've talked to a lot of land managers, government land managers, land trusts, and they all say, you know, I was talking to the federal agency that manages the Silvio Oconte wildlife area, which is, I mean, it's just completely overgrown with invasives. And they're setting it up to be an outdoor classroom. It was like, I was polite, but I was like, what are you going to teach them about? This is not a natural ecosystem. And they said, yeah, we know. And I said, well, isn't there something you could do about the invasives? And they said, well, our department manages 40,000 acres and we have 11 employees and 2 of them are administrative. Don't even go out in the field. Yeah, that, I mean, what are they going to do? If anyone's going to do anything, it's going to be massive chemicals. So again, you know, do this for future generations, for the health of the planet. If you can manage to do things with minimal chemicals, you're preventing the chemicals from coming in after you're gone. Another option in certain situations is a controlled burn. This doesn't work for all species. I've read that it's really pretty useless against bittersweet. It does, it can work. It's in Massachusetts, it requires a lot of organization. You can't do it yourself. You need certified people. You may need just all kinds of regulations about it. You need exactly the right weather conditions in order for it to be safe. So even to schedule it and organize it is probably an enormous task. But I know there are people who do it and do it successfully. So, you know, if you have the wherewithal, I don't want to discourage you. So the moral of the story with all these methods is understand what you've got and do the research to make sure you're using the right method, because you could be spending a lot of time and energy and possibly money and just making things worse. So you've gone out, you've cut, you have a pile of brush. How do you dispose of what you've got? Because a lot of this stuff, if you just leave it on the ground, is going to resprout. So again, understand what species you're dealing with, understand whether that can resprout from a little piece. If it can resprout from a little piece, put it on a tarp. My favorite thing to do is I pile it up. I have an asphalt driveway, which in the heat of summer is really good at cooking things, baking them, drying them out. I'm pretty sure that they're really dead. You could burn them. I know people who make a giant pile and then they have a giant, you know, I guess in January when it's legal to burn, they have a giant fire. I'm not sure that's really necessary, because by the time maybe it's necessary for bittersweet seeds. You know, if you can keep them in a place where they won't resprout. You can also just stack the brush so that the roots are up in the air and not touching the ground. Bag and bake is pretty easy to do if you don't have a huge amount of material, or if you can just put the, you know, whatever resprouting material, put it in a black plastic bag, leave it in the sun. Bittersweet seeds are killed at 140 degrees. So you can even stick a thermometer in there and make sure that it gets hot enough. If you have any living material, don't contaminate your compost pile. If you do have a really, really huge area, like, you know, you're weed whacking a big hedgerow and it's full of bittersweet, you're not going to be able to haul all of it out. Plus, a lot of the bittersweet vines are going to be up in the trees, and you do not want to pull those vines out, because you could hurt the trees. So just let them die. Yes, the seeds will fall. Some of the seeds will resprout, but that's really you really don't have any alternative in that situation. Okay, so now we're going to go through this little horror show. Starting with Japanese knotweed. This is particularly bad for wetland areas and along stream margins. Just as an aside, I often drive up 116 through the, you know, from Northampton up through Cummington, and it runs along the stream, and for about, I would guess about 10 miles, there was solid knotweed. That was all there was. The whole stream ecosystem had become just a single monoculture of knotweed. And then last year, somebody, I don't know who it was, went through and sprayed it, and most of it's dead now, but it was foliar spray. And I just, you know, I was glad the knotweed was gone, but I was also thinking, think of all the herbicide that just went into that stream and was swept downstream and is now everywhere else. You know, it's just, it's just horrible to think about. But so this is why those wild and scenic people go to the headwaters to attack the knotweed, because the knotweed parts are swept downstream and then they get the whole system, the whole stream system. So they, as you know, if you have ever dealt with any knotweed, it has amazing abilities to resprout. And but all of my sources, including people who have done this personally, say you really, really can get rid of this just mechanically with repeated cutting. Some of the people, I know people who've just mowed it every single year or several times a year, maybe many, many times a year, took a few years. But I've also been told it's much more effective if you rake up and bag all the cut parts, all the stems, because they can resprout from the stems. So this is a case where if you bag it, put it in a black plastic bag, let it die on your asphalt driveway, then you've dealt with it pretty effectively. But I really think this is one that could be dealt with mechanically, strictly mechanically. It does take persistence, but it can be done. I've spoken to a lot of people who've actually done it, eliminated a huge stand of knotweed. Bittersweet, oh my God, this is the worst. I see it everywhere I look. It's all along our roadsides, conservation areas, farmlands. I think it's only going to be a matter of time before it's going to be most of the biomass in Massachusetts. I think it's pretty easy to identify, but if you're in doubt, just pull up a chunk of it. It has these very bright orange roots, very, very distinctive. It does look different as it matures, and this is why I think it's important to kind of familiarize yourself with it at all stages of growth. You can get rid of this by cutting it at the soil level repeatedly. It's going to take a lot of persistence, but this is a good candidate for the cut and paint approach. And so make sure that it will also resprout from the seeds, it will resprout from the roots. So sometimes I'm out in the middle of nowhere and I just can't help myself. I start pulling bittersweet. I will sometimes like wedge it in the Y of a tree, or I'll tie it to a tree to make sure that the roots don't touch the soil. You can see one of these pictures. This will actively pull down trees. You can see how it wraps itself around whatever plant it's growing on. And even in I even have in my yard, I have saplings that now have like corkscrew shapes permanently embedded in their trunks of where I've cut away the bittersweet. This is relatively harmless, but you know, they actually strangle the tree. And then the other problem with bittersweet and other also there are the vines. This is a problem with too, particularly our native grape, and sometimes multiflora rose will grow into trees, is that it turns the tree into both a giant sail. So in a heavy wind, the tree is more likely to be taken down. And also the tree then gets a much heavier snow load. So in a very heavy, wet snow, it's more likely to bring down the tree. Of course, it's killing the tree because it's blocking a lot of sunlight to the tree too. So this is really, really a serious problem. Multiflora rose, also very, very common. It does spread rapidly. I've seen it take over like a huge unused field. So if you have unused fields on your property, it's really important not to let it get a toehold. And if it does, make sure you mow that field every year, preferably in late spring. It will grow up. It will grow up as a vine, you know, it could grow up like 50 feet. And it will just overspread a tree. It will become, as bittersweet, it will become a lump, a giant lump in the landscape with a dead plant underneath it. Have you guys heard of rose rosette disease? This is now a disease that's spreading through people's rose gardens, imported roses. There's no cure for it. And this is a vector for rose rosette disease. I personally say, you know, have at it, rose rosette disease, kill all those multiflora roses. But I haven't seen that much of it. But in the landscape, I've seen some stuff that I think is rose rosette disease, but it's not killing these multiflora roses fast enough. But this is one that's it's pretty easy to pull the small plants. I have these like really thick gloves that are impervious to thorns, and I just rip them out of the ground. And if they're little, easy, no problem. Glossy buckthorn. Okay, this is number 4 on my hit parade of awful plants. It's very, very, very common in the landscape. I don't think it's as easy to spot as the others. It's a shrub or small tree. It's also seems to prefer wet areas, but it'll grow anywhere. It seems like a lot of these plants that have berries, birds eat the berries, the birds sit in the tree, the birds poop. Then there's this understory of these bushes. And there are some conservation areas that I walk in that are just solid buckthorn, like impervious stand of buckthorn. Can barely get a crowbar in there. I think they're pretty distinctive. They have these glossy leaves. There's also another species of buckthorn. I think it's called common buckthorn. It's also invasive, so don't try too hard to tell the difference between the two. Just get rid of them. If you're looking when they don't have leaves, the bark is pretty distinctive. They have these kind of white spots on them. But the other plant that has white spots is our native cherries, and you don't want to get rid of those. Those are really valuable. So again, their small plants are pretty easy to pull, but bigger plants you can cut or cut and paint. These aren't nearly as hard to get rid of as the bittersweet and the knotweed. Autumn olive. I see a lot of fields, open fields that have just become full of autumn olive. Another berry that the birds love. I've heard that they are delicious to eat for people. So you could eat them before you cut them down. They produce a huge number of seeds. So that's one reason why they spread so rapidly. And again, the small plants are the easiest to get rid of. So another reason to attack these things when they're small. Okay, mugwort. This is a very scary plant. You've probably seen this all along the roadsides. It's very, very common, particularly where there's like a barrier and the DPW can't really get their mower in. I guess it has medicinal properties. It's actually very pleasant to pull up because it smells nice. So that's a little benefit of going after it. The best thing to do with this is, I don't think this requires any herbicides. This you can pull up. I pull it up myself, and I have some meadows that I periodically patrol looking for mugwort. The main thing is you don't want to let it set seed, but it also suckers. But this is one that responds really, really well to smothering, but you have to make sure if you have a patch of it, you want your whatever material used to smother it with to be really either deep or really strong, like, you know, really thick cardboard or several layers of cardboard, and then a layer of wood chips. I've also just read recently that you could put like a foot of wood chips without the cardboard, and that will do it. So this one is, you know, just takes persistence, but this one is probably easier to manage. It's just so quick to take root in a field. And for people who are trying to establish a pollinator meadow, this is one of the ones you have to look out for, because it will quickly outcompete the native plants that you're trying to get established. So if that's something you're doing, really be on the lookout for this mugwort. Yes?
I'm not familiar with it. Isn't ragweed?
No.
Because it looks like ragweed.
It does look like ragweed, but yeah, ragweed isn't good either, but it's not. No, it's an Artemisia. It has kind of grayish leaves. It's fragrant. Yeah, I'm not sure mugwort is actually in this one, but anyway, yeah, look it up. I'm sure you have it. Oh, here's another clue. If you look at this lower picture, before it starts really getting tall and flowering, the leaves really look like chrysanthemum leaves. So, Japanese barberry. I see this a lot near me. People have planted it as an ornamental, and then it sort of gets into a fence line and nobody really bothers to deal with it. But this is especially bad because it's perfect habitat for mice, which are a vector for Lyme disease. So areas where there's a lot of barberry have a much higher incidence of Lyme disease. So good reason to get rid of the barberry. And again, you know, it's you can control it just by pulling the small plants and cutting and painting. Asian honeysuckles. There's actually quite a few species out there. They were brought into this country like the barberry. They were brought in as ornamentals or for erosion control. They are they're pretty common in the landscape. They have these very distinctive red berries. Starting about now, you'll see them through the fall. But because there's a bunch of different species, it's probably, this is where I really like to get out my identification app to make, you know, because they're similar but not identical, so I want to make sure I know what it is. But these are pretty tough. They really resprout very vigorously. So this is one where the cutting and painting is probably the best method. So here are some ones that are not, maybe not the worst, but they are ones that you may have in your yard just as ornamentals. And I want you to understand how bad they are and that you should get rid of them. And I know for a lot of people, this is going to be really hard to hear. One of the worst is Norway maple. As you drive through the landscape, you know, those maples that have the red leaves, those are called Crimson King. And they were just really pushed by the plant trade for many years. And they are horribly invasive. The seeds sprout up just really quickly. And, you know, a lot of these trees are huge and they're gorgeous. And if I tell people you really need to get rid of that, then they just can't hear me. They just know this is the most gorgeous tree in my yard and I can't get rid of it. So at the very least, try to eliminate any of the seedlings that might be growing up in any wild areas. Burning bush, another one. People love their burning bushes. This is the same thing as a winged euonymus. No, I have to say it is a lovely plant, has a beautiful natural shape. turns bright, bright, bright red in the fall. But and as in this picture, and there's actually a place like this very near my house, the entire understory is burning bush. And you don't notice it until the fall. You're driving along and you're like, wow, look at that. The whole understory is pink. It's because it's all burning bush. It's because there's no more understory. And remember, the deer do not eat this. So that means whatever few native plants are left in that woodland are going to be totally chomped by the deer. And I have also been told by a lot of land managers that if they want to preserve any part of their native landscape, they have to fence it in. They have to put a deer fence, that the deer pressure is because there's there's a lot of deer and there's not enough deer food in there, that the presence of deer is one of the biggest problems they have when they're trying to regenerate. And this is one of the reasons, is that the understory is now unpalatable to deer. So I really think a responsible landowner would cut down their burning bush. Bradford pear. Does everyone know what Bradford pear is? It's this, it's actually another lovely tree. It's on the prohibited plants list, but 5 years aren't up, so you can still buy it at a nursery. It's, you know, it looks like a pear, but it doesn't have any fruit. And it's a very, very common street tree. And this is what this many, many, many unused fields in the South look like. It isn't quite that invasive here yet, but with global warming, it will be taking over our fields like this. I visit my daughter in North Carolina. I drive down 81 in the spring, and for hundreds of miles, I see whole fields that are just Bradford pear. And it's very distinctive in the spring when it's blooming. Huge fields just full of acres and acres, hundreds of thousands of acres of Bradford pear. And so if you have one, I really think you need to get rid of it. There's beautiful, beautiful native plants that could easily be substituted for burning bush. There's beautiful native plants that have excellent fall foliage. And similarly for Bradford pear, there's really nice native plants that have great spring, white spring flowers. The last one, well, I might mention one more if I have time. There's Tree of Heaven. I haven't seen that around my area, but that doesn't mean it isn't there. But
every
this
cloverleaf in New England,
what
every highway interchange cloverleaf
has
is
this.
full of islands.
Well, it's the preferred food for is the spotted lanternfly. So if you have this in your yard, it's like saying, "Yoo-hoo, spotted lanternfly, come to my yard." And then once it's done with the Tree of Heaven, it's going to eat everything else. So this is a really good reason to get rid of the Tree of Heaven. Yeah, it was planted. There's one more that I just want to mention. Goutweed. Do you know what that is? It's this low growing plant. Sometimes it's variegated, sometimes it's plain. I see it everywhere. It was planted, you know, like it's in a lot of parks. It was planted as a ground cover. You know, I knew that it was bad, but I was up in Nova Scotia. I'm walking on the headlands of Cape Breton Island, and you walk out, you know, quite a ways over these beautiful peninsulas that stick out into the ocean. And I'm looking down, and there's this ground cover. It's everywhere. It's like covers the whole headland. And you know how you don't recognize something when it's like out of context? Like my brain could not wrap. It was just like, I know this plant, but what could it be? So I used my app, and it was goutweed. It was miles and miles of goutweed. That was all that was growing there. It was taking over this very, very fragile kind of alpine marine environment. It was becoming goutweed. So that is the danger. Even if you think oh, you know, I just have a little bit and it's not going anywhere in my yard, so I'm not going to worry about it. You don't know where that plant is going. You don't know what, if, especially if there's berries, that plant is making tracks. It's going somewhere else. It's not just your problem. You're making it, you're spreading it by not doing anything, you're spreading it. So that's why I bring up that goutweed situation. So this is a useful chart that you can get from the Connecticut site. These are what they list as the top problem plants and the ideal time to treat it and what they recommend as the treatment. So I think this is useful, but if you can't follow this calendar, follow whatever calendar you can. So also, if you have any large pieces of property, I have 3.5 acres and I cannot eliminate all the invasives on it. All I can do is manage it. So, so make sure, so you have to take a triage approach. So the first thing is, which I've been emphasizing, choose the best method. Don't try something that's not going to work. The second thing is do your best to save the trees, especially oaks. Oaks are the most valuable wildlife plant in the landscape. They support the largest number of caterpillars. Caterpillars are baby bird food. Without caterpillars, you don't have baby birds. And our bird population is crashing too. So, you know, prioritize the oaks. So get those vines out of the trees. I cut grapevines too, even though it's a native plant. I don't cut the other vines. I don't cut Virginia creeper. It doesn't hurt the plants, but the grapevine will bring down the trees. So if you have a large property to manage, choose a section that you think you can handle. And it should be something that you're there a lot, so you can keep an eye on it without making a special trip, and then try to really manage it well. And then that will be your little piece of natural landscape. Cut the plants at flowering before the plants at seed. This is really crucial. If you can't get rid of all of the plants, at least keep them from reproducing. As I mentioned, mowing the unused fields will keep down the multiflora rows, dispose of the remains so you don't spread them. If you miss the optimum time, just go at it when you have time. And it takes persistence, as I've mentioned. And they're not going to go away. You're never, I thought when I first started this, oh, I'm going to clear this area and then it'll be done. No. I'll be back, they'll be back, but it's so much easier when the plants are smaller. So I've really, one of the areas that I've committed to managing, I have a very long driveway that's woods on both sides. It's like 300 feet, so it's 600 feet. And I just go through, you know, usually twice a year. And first I had to cut and paint. Now I can just pull up the plants with my gloves. I rarely have to cut anything, but they grow fast. Boy, I'm just amazed. I'll come back a year later and there'll be a buckthorn that's like as tall as I am. Like, how did you get away from me? How did that happen? But they grow so fast. So you have to really persist. So as I said, new plants will always be appearing. Okay, you've cleared an area, you've made space. Now what? What should you do? So something is going to fill that space. Probably what's ever in the seed bank, maybe good stuff. I hear a lot of reports of people who cleared a whole area of invasives and then just great native plants started popping up. That's good. So keep an eye on what's growing there and try to figure out what it is. As I said, the invasives will return, monitor it, and then try to really encourage any tree seedlings if it's in an edge habitat or if it's in woodland area, because as I said, our trees are in trouble. And this alien understory is really keeping the next generation of trees from growing. So try to encourage tree seedlings. And then there's a lot of tough invasive plants, not invasive, aggressive plants that you could plant. You know, this is where that Canada goldenrod might come to your rescue. This is a picture of obedient plant, which once it gets going, it forms a really thick mat. Nothing else is going to go in there.
Disobedient plant.
What?
Disobedient.
Disobedient plant. But yeah, it's beautiful. It's a lovely plant, very easy to propagate. So I included in my resources, there's a list of tough native plants that Nancy Lawson came up with. But I really have to emphasize, you have to choose the right plant for the right place. Something that's really tough in one environment will not grow at all in another environment. So understand where you want to put the plant and plant the right plant there. Something I've seen a lot along roadsides, wooded roadsides, the ferns, I wouldn't say they completely eliminate bittersweet, but along where I live, there's thick stands of ferns that are maintained because the DPW mows. And, you know, the ferns don't seem to mind the mowing, but I see very, very little bittersweet in those ferns. So hay-scented fern, that's a really tough one. Not a pollinator plant, I'm sorry, but it will hold the territory for you. So, you know, you have to kind of do your research and choose the right plant for the right place. And there is that list. So here's my QR code. If you want to take a picture of it, that will get you to the resource list. Everybody got it? I can take questions, but I just want to say in this picture, I took this in a conservation area near where I live. And in this picture, there's buckthorn, honeysuckle, autumn olive, and bittersweet, all in this one frame, and hardly anything else. This is what much of our conservation area looks like. I didn't have to look very far to take this picture. Anyway, questions? Yes.
You didn't mention vinegar.
Yeah.
I find it very useful.
If you do, go for it. What I really worry about is that you're going to be changing the soil pH and you're going to be killing the microorganisms and the fungus. What?
After it breaks down, it adds a B vitamin.
Yeah. Well, so, you know, I don't know how long
Yeah.
it persists in the soil.
It doesn't,
And
that I know of.
okay, well, if it's not, I think you have to use a lot of it. And, you know, if for a small area or a single plant, it might be the best choice. So if you're having good luck with it, go for it.
If you get it young,
Yeah.
if you white vinegar and you get it young,
Yeah,
it's very effective.
yeah,
Just keep at it. But
right. Yeah,
white vinegar.
but it is going to change the soil pH. It is going to change. It's going to really change. It's going to kill a lot of stuff in there. But, you know, if it bounces back, fine. You know, yes.
Talked a little bit at the end about the planting native progressive plants, etc. After you pulled out the
Mhm.
invasives, I'm wondering, it seems like you mostly focus on that sort of initial elimination phase. Is that just sort of your method, or have you found like that kind of replacing with other plants not effective, or does that make sense? Like, it seems like, is there a way to actually pull in the plants that you want more and focus on kind of moving past that elimination?
Well, one question a lot of people ask is they want to know, is there something that they can plant that will like outcompete the invasive plants that are already there? I don't know of anything that will, if you have a good healthy stand of an invasive plant, there is no native plant that's going to come in and compete with it and outgrow it. No, not going to happen. Yeah.
I haven't experienced. I have a lot of bishopsweed and goutweed.
Yeah.
Really big problem. And I've been working really hard to try to figure out what can outcompete a certain area of it. And I have had a really, really good success in the sunny area with Helianthus, the wild Helianthus. Just driving I mean, I've tried Canada and then it would work. I thought that was gonna be aggressive enough and it wouldn't work. But the Helianthus is just like, and I have a big area that
That's great.
that I'm willing to let it be this huge stand, and I cut it down so it's not.
Well, that's probably, that's because the goutweed really prefers shade. So the goutweed is probably on the edge of its preferred environment, and Helianthus loves sun. So you have the perfect, you chose the perfect plant for that situation. So that just, I think you've illustrated my point, is that you have to choose a plant that's going to be just so robust in that environment, but there's no like silver bullet there, you know.
I had another experience, which I think I'd like to share just because
Yeah.
it's kind of instructional. I have a very wet area that was just completely filled with multiflora rose and some bittersweet, but mostly multiflora rose. And I got myself a weed wrench, you know, to just pull it out by the roots. And the water that runs down from the hillside goes into a pond, eroding because I pulled out the roots of the multiflora rose. So now I have this pile of silt in the middle of my pond that I didn't have before. I did successfully get rid of the rose for the most part. But the stuff that I put in there was just too young. I put in some cedars, I put in some sedge, I put in some steeplebush. I put in a lot of wet loving plants, but they're too young to do what the rose was doing to soul. I don't think it was wrong.
No, but that actually brings up a point that I wanted to make, is that I am as much as possible a no-till gardener. And one of the reasons is that I want to maintain the soil structure, and people, you know, if you just cut at the soil line, the roots, even if they're dead, are going to be holding the soil for a while until they rot. So, you know, I think that's a good argument for doing just repeated cutting or cut and paint, because you keep the soil and those roots intact. Yeah, I have a friend who is afraid to get rid of her knotweed because it's holding the soil on a bank. But I think if she just cut it repeatedly, then, and at the right time started introducing something else, that she would not have an erosion problem. I don't think she would, but you're right, that could happen. And yeah, but I'm glad you said that. That's something to think about. Yeah.
They hold the microorganisms in the soil too.
Yeah.
A question, when you were talking about the changes to the soil, one of the things about many of the commercially available pesticides, herbicides, whatever you want to call them, is that they, especially glyphosate and triclosan, affect the bacteria, the soil bacteria.
Right.
And they, when they get into the soil, the bacteria that are genetically predisposed to vulnerability get killed. And the ones that are genetically predisposed to be resistant multiply.
Right.
So you're creating a situation, an opportunity for the things in the soil that you don't want.
Right.
And that's a very good reason not to put liquid poisons down.
Well, you know, I think when I cut and paint even a fairly large trunk, you know, even one that's could even maybe an inch or more in diameter, I'm probably using like maybe a quarter teaspoon.
Right.
So, you know, there's no good answer.
So many variables.
You try to do the least harm
Right.
that you can.
And I have another question. try to find research about these issues all the time.
Yeah.
And on the question of whether or not newly arrived dominant plants are good or not good for the native birds or other
Yeah.
browsers and things like that. I cannot find any reliable, peer-reviewed publication, good publication things that that shows me the science on whether or not birds are benefiting or being harmed by the fruits.
Okay.
All right?
Well, I have seen, I can't cite them off the top of my head, but I have seen peer-reviewed papers that say there is evidence that these like bittersweet berries are not as nutritious for native
And
songbirds.
everything that I've studied about it says that one of the things that nobody's paying attention to is the fact that as birds eat the things that are newly in their environment, they adapt and create a symbiosis that provides them benefit.
Okay, here's the bottom line for these invasive plants. I have probably pulled out hundreds of thousands of, I have looked at hundreds of thousands of leaves of bittersweet. I have never seen any evidence, any little tiny hole, any tiny bite of anything on a bittersweet. That means no insects are eating bittersweet. They're completely impervious. It could be that the birds eat the berries. Maybe they're getting great nutrition, but adult birds are the only ones that eat berries. Baby birds need caterpillars or insects. So if you don't have any baby food, you don't have baby birds, you don't have adult birds. Bottom line. And there's the famous study by one of Doug Talamy's students, Desiree Narango, who's now at UMass. It was just one study, but it was extremely definitive in a suburban landscape that was less than 70% native plants. Carolina chickadees could not reproduce. They could not find enough caterpillars. One clutch of Carolina chickadees takes 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to raise that clutch, like probably 3 chicks. That's a lot of caterpillars. That takes native plants. So
Do
if
we
you
have Carolina chickadees?
yeah, we do. But that's true of most birds, almost all birds. 96% of our songbirds feed babies insects. Very, very few baby birds can eat seeds or berries. I want songbirds. I want my food web to be intact. And for that, I can't have bittersweet. Bittersweet cannot be the dominant species in the landscape, which is the case. And I'm getting more and more every day, you know, and people say, even responsible people, ecologists who should know better say, well, yeah, eventually the insects will adapt. Yeah, eventually some of them will adapt, but in the meantime, most species are going to go extinct. And the evolutionary time is hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. And okay, maybe in 100,000 or million years, there'll be this great flowering of new species that will adapt to our new alien environment. But what about all the species that are going to die in the meantime? It's going to be as bad as when the asteroid killed off the dinosaurs. We're facing a major extinction here. And yeah, things will adapt, probably, if we haven't completely poisoned the planet, but not in our lifetimes, maybe not even when humans are still on the planet. We're talking evolutionary time. Yeah, so that's why I think that argument is not, it is just wrong. That things will adapt. Yeah, a few things will adapt, sure. But overall, most things will go extinct. So, any other questions? I'm sorry.
I just want to make one statement.
Yeah.
About 4 years ago, John Kemp was here
Mhm.
and he talked to us about boron
Yeah.
and about how boron continually placed on a plant will eventually kill an invasive.
Yeah.
And I don't hear a lot of
I
that.
have not read anything about boron.
Well, I know it's worked really well for some people that we've told to on our farm.
Uh-huh.
The thing is that it's gonna kill everything,
Right,
okay?
right.
The good thing is, the water supply needs it. The trees are in desperate need of boron, desperate. Right now, every tree that we work with needs boron. You have enough boron in a tree, you'll never get a borer. You'll never get the Asian beetle that's born into the trees.
Yeah, but what about all the native insects that live in those trees?
But they'll find different habitat. It's not that you're not killing them, it's their choice, they're gonna leave. They leave.
Some things can't leave.
What do you think?
I worry, I worry about these quote unquote natural and organic methods as much as I worry about chemical methods. That's the bottom line. Oh, you had a question. Did I get your question?
We are over time. That's
Sorry.
okay.
Feel free to sign up for after as well. I'm sure you'll answer questions.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
And also, at the table, the Massachusetts Pollinator Network table. And there's a whole bunch of people there. Also, there is money available if you have land that you would like to do ecological restoration. There's this, the government will give you matching money. So. Matching money, not free money.
No, we